Hi. Hello. Hello. Greetings, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I'm so excited. I welcome you to this recitation, which is an experiment in form and intimacy. That is, in so many capacities, what is here is an attempt at conjuring the sense of intimacy I value so highly, while it is simultaneously a clear recognition that this experiment will fail. There is nothing this form can truly accomplish, save through its methodology the generation of the urgency, the needful launch pad for a further series of experiments. I implore you to please hold this close as I attempt to make what happens here helpful, interesting, and illustrative of the mundanity of the revolution at hand. As was said to me, what matters has to matter every day. I will try to hold, to the best of my abilities, any mistakes I make and be accountable. But there's a lot to be done, and I don't have a lot of time, especially given the precarious conditions I find myself in. If economic inflation is the phenomena of the price of goods increasing such that the volume of currency needed to purchase the same goods also increases, then perhaps I'm in a moment of temporal inflation, where the price of a minute increases such that I must sell myself for longer in order to buy back the moments that I lose. For example, a vacation with my family, perhaps. If I spend too much time here in this recitation, then I may find myself trapped even further within the debts and deficits of the time economy. And I could jump straight into Debord's comments on the subsumption of space to time, though I worry that to speak out of turn or to be ill-prepared would only continue mounting temporal deficits against myself. Though, should I hope to contest the dominating forces of capitalist time, how would that manifest? How does the recitational form I attempt to employ here now encourage, dismay, or leave untouched the clock on the wall, or the relations between me and you, or me and anyone else, or anyone else and you, or anyone else for that matter? In the illness-inducing warp of space as compliant to time, what processes can still be performed through a spatial dimension? Is there nothing left but temporal immediacy, pulses of stimulus and intensity? Further, how might I claim agency within a realm of damaging psychogeographies or platforms? Does the dismantling of the professionalization of academic practices actually proffer a positivistic development? Regardless, I cannot begin to resist capitalist time without understanding capitalism as such. And most importantly, I need you, or more importantly, unclear the levels of importance here, I need you to agree with me on these terms and definitions. To understand the importance of anti-capitalist practice and to attempt to enact a dialectical development of history, I must understand the mechanisms of the prevailing modes. And I say prevailing modes for two significant reasons. First, in the theoretical, I must make central claims made by two feminist Marxist geographers who wrote together under the pen name J.K. Gibson Graham. They claim that there are holes in what appears to me as an all-encompassing frame or hegemonic structure. So I will avoid making the mistakes that Gibson Graham identify with the majority of theoretical lineages of Marxist discourse, which often claim that, or allow for no alternative to the view or to the notion that capitalism is unified, total, and singular. Admittedly, many before and many after J.K. Gibson Graham have put forward this critique of Marxist discourses, but recognizing these holes or places where capitalism cannot fully claim dominance allows a shift to be made. So I might both allude to the ways in which at times can thoroughly dominate me, while simultaneously providing the linguistic and thus material potentials for further sites of contestation to occur, like perhaps even this lecture or recitation, as I was saying before. So I must be cautious of my angle of approach when using language and my vision, discussing what capitalism means for fear of reproducing a preventable mistake. And secondly, I cannot dare to maintain the illusion that this recitation is a standalone endeavor, that you and I are the only ones aware or becoming aware of these conditions, for there have been long-standing practices of anti-capitalism in every geographic scale one might imagine. The way capitalism presents itself as an all-encompassing frame allows it to actively hide rebellion and dismantle the subversive messages that are invoked by so-called radicals or revolutionaries. It becomes difficult to imagine a history of resistance, and yet I would never need to imagine or conjure or substitute reality for fantasy. Rather, I might simply look in, or even more simply look at a library. For libraries have long been sites of subversion, resistance, and documentation. As an archive of archives, the library stands as a powerful reminder of what can be done communally, often holding blueprints to resistance. So given capitalism's power, I must ask, how can capitalism appear to me as an all-encompassing frame, and how has it developed the ability to rewrite history? And to be honest, I don't ever really quite answer those two questions, and they're vital, but unable to really be answered in this one instance. But so to move forward at this juncture, in my mind, still requires invoking Karl Marx, which it feels incredibly divisive, like I might create a rift between you and me if I were to do so. Despite the fact that Marx is really an authority to understanding a particular construction of what capitalism means, doing so generates a new layer of persona on top of me. I'm no longer Josh reciting to you what I've written for you, but Josh suddenly reciting a Marxist lecture, perhaps. But citing Marx doesn't actually really change anything, for the construction of this room has already imposed my body with a set of values quite apparently. So if I were to invoke humanness, if I were to encourage you to see through to my blood, it would be because I'm only self-conscious that in this place I'm only facade, emptied of meaning. So while I could at length expound upon the anxieties like this and many, many others arising, I will not allow myself to be mired or caught within a paralytic series of thoughts, for I have to get over it anyways. For if I were to simply outline Marx's arguments in Capital Volume 1 without recognizing from whom these ideas are truly sourced, it would be much harder to live with this contrived veneer rather than this ostensible faux self-awareness you might read me as constructing now. Nevertheless, to surmise Volume 1 of Capital is difficult in and of itself. The nuances of Marx's quantitative and secondary ethnographic analyses are truly what makes this incomplete project his magnum opus. So the first step of his analysis begins with understanding the commodity as such, and so which in Marx's own words is the foundational value structure of society. Each commodity is composed of three forms of value: the use value, which is how useful a commodity is; the exchange value, which is how much currency is exchanged for the commodity; and a more conceptual value of abstract labor held within the commodity, which is the basis of exchange value. And I'm sure this makes a lot more sense in German, that use value, exchange value, and value are the three the three terms. But so this is simply an elusively termed value that is the congealment of all the work in the commodity and is summed through abstracting labor from its concrete duties into a relativistic assessment of the technologies and productive capacities of a given economy. An economy here is meaning more of like a geographic zone of commodity production, which could be scale or an unfixed. But rather than comparing the duties of a brickmaker and an automaker, values the consideration of the amount of time needed to produce equal quantities of values, of exchange value. So where the automaker might take an hour to produce $100 of value, a brickmaker takes 2 hours to produce $100 of value, or an hour to produce $50 of value. The value of that labor is half as valuable as the automaker. So these three values are applicable to all commodities and even objects that are traded as commodities, though they are not. Space is technically not a produced object, and yet I'm often buying access to space as though it were a commodity, or rather, commodity purchases serve as my claim to occupying space, especially in public. And I think a state park is sort of a vital, really interesting example, that we go to a state park because it's useful to us as a place of enjoyment or recreation, but we exchange a certain amount of currency in relation to the value that it takes to hold that space. However, it's not simply that I'm just at times producing or at times consuming commodities. Commodities are always around me, hovering, clinging to, wrapping around, sleeping with me. I've filled my life with the objects of other people's labor. I labor constantly over commodities, and I've even constructed my notions of what a life means by my ability to sell my labor as though it were a commodity as well. I go to school to learn how to be a smart worker. I meet with my clergy to learn what it means to be a faithful worker. And so each role in society is not some ideal role of ethical person, but the role of some kind of laborer. The questions of what I do become constitutive of what I am. In the same way that Sarah Ahmed claims, the category of things one likes tends to lend itself to determining what one is like. In this capacity, I'm present in front of you, not as another human, but as a producer of a kind of value. And this manner of seeing is hugely prescient to this recitation. This truly is a production, having undergone some kind of process that is masked from you by the nature of buying into this commodity. While you didn't have to pay for access to this space in the same way that you might pay for a roll of toilet paper, this recitation and toilet paper do hold in common that you did not, and in fact could not, bear witness to the production of either. And in consuming each, there is a subtle acceptance of this role of ignorance to the conditions or social relations of production. You don't know if your toilet paper is produced in a sweatshop or if this recitation was produced in the lavish home of a multimillionaire, though of course your toilet paper is likely produced in a sweatshop, and this was definitely not produced in a multimillionaire's mansion. But I do not wish to operate under any false pretenses here. I'm hoping that we might generate a space that's contestable, that we might challenge what is expected of ourselves as a result of each of us taking on different roles in the space. Maybe you'll jump on the phone and get chicken wings or pizza delivered, or you'll get up and use the bathroom or go for a smoke as many times as you need. Taking care of yourself in this space offers a practice of contesting traditional norms imposed by passive consumption. So while the architecture of the space really makes it utterly inconvenient to do so, please do use the bathroom, get food, whatever you need. If you need to leave early, please do so. If you want to leave and come back, whatever you need to do, the space is also yours as well. So both the production of the commodity and the consumption of the commodity, one often but not always precipitating the other, are processes of wealth making. The capitalist is making a killing figuratively and literally through the production process, which is to say, the capitalist unethically acquires a profit and subsequently unethically distributes the profit in the form of what Marx calls wage slavery. The consumption of the commodity is an unethical act in and of itself, as it substantiates and legitimates the production process as such. So I am entirely complicit in the capitalist cycle, which has become ingrained in the articulation of government even, which feigns to protect the citizen worker while truly working to make the expropriation and degradation of the life of the worker tolerable, to extend the capitalist timeline of production as long as possible. And even despite legal codes that Marx outlines extensively, the delineation of the working day seems to have developed dialectically in favor of the capitalist. That is, if the capitalist class couldn't forever demand a 14-hour working day from the working class, then the capitalist class would curate what is the contemporary moment, the sublimation of the working day into every aspect of every minute. And that is sort of the crux of a lot of the argument here, but it'll really be expanded throughout the recitation. Another primary challenge that capitalism presents is what Marx termed social reproduction, which I understand is all the duties necessary to make going back to work tomorrow possible. Sleeping, cooking, socializing, all that makes living life bearable and possible. These practices aren't inherently problematic, but they become so under capitalism. And feminists and feminist theorists are particularly interested in the labor that occurs in the continuation of everyday life. This is largely because historically, this labor has been feminized and invisibilized, meaning it's been unethically distributed not solely along class lines, but additionally significantly along the delineations of gender, and as often goes unwaged. Child rearing, homemaking, emotional laboring, cleaning, all of this is work that historically men haven't done and don't do. In a feminist model of the capitalist realm, the unequal distribution of wealth implicates the non-masculine laborer by enforcing an unethical distribution of labor. All laborers undertaking feminized work face more work at home and are systematically forced to work for longer hours due to a variety of gaps in the distributions of pay, sleep, and visibility, among many others. In constructing or attempting to construct even a rudimentary intersectional model, I might also note how critical race theorists center the historical precedents of chattel slavery and other forms of racialized violence and exploitation in the development of capitalism. And this is sort of vital that we come to an agreement on this, that enslavement is a vital crux of capitalism, and it's part of the logic of capitalism is that value can only be created by some form of procedural laboring. And enslavement offers a form of wealth accumulation by destroying communities, identities, and whole worlds of life, and beginning a process of destruction of the earth that is currently underway, creating sort of ideological derangements and allowing sort of bare life to occur, which is sort of a broader idea that doesn't quite get expanded in here. But so enslavement continues everywhere in a variety of forms alongside contemporary chattel slavery and requires persistent, unyielding demolishment at every turn. Capitalism, as predominantly construction of whiteness, and particularly patriarchal whiteness at that, creates a system of falsified living that rejects the earth as necessary for survival and even rejects human life as necessary for economic growth. That is to say, undoing life or unraveling the potential for life to continue further down the line is fundamental to perpetuating infinite growth on a planet of limited resources. And further, it's not hard to trace intergenerational wealth accumulation by families who enslaved humans during any time period, and the intergenerational accumulation of multiplicitous kinds of debts by families who were enslaved. All of this normalized historical violence generates an ideological delusion that anyone can make the world to their desires by any means necessary. Destruction of the world with utter disregard and disdain for the life that depends on it, including our own as humans, has doomed all of us, but in the usual pattern of capitalism, the destruction of life is unethically distributed organically or inorganically, depending on how you want to look at the distributions of capitalism. But so utilizing or attempting to utilize even this rudimentary intersectional model, I'm compelled to investigate the ways in which all violence, wealth, and all possibly distributable properties within the system are unethically distributed. Access to education, water, food, time, visibility, life itself, even as Achille and Mbembe is notably and extensively illustrated. I keep in mind constantly how these are unethically distributed even in my own homes and communities. So in all of this, I might even consider the actual necessities of housework and the feminization of those responsibilities and the gendered and racialized dynamics of who does housework in which house and when and what age they are, and the many forms of segmentation and fragmentation of all laboring that keeps everyone from seeing each other clearly. There are multiple ways to track these networked and geographically distinct and significant systems of laboring. For example, I could track individual laborers and take note of which forms of labor they come into direct contact, trace contact, tangential contact, or oblique contact with over the course of a given day, month, or year. I could witness the ways in which privileged, wealthy male laborers are able to dynamically interact and influence others through various kinds of contact in various settings and maintain ubiquitous ease, while the systematically dominated and oppressed laborers are forced into singular roles or particular elevations or particular forms of perpetual stress. Alternately, I might consider addressing the single building or office or home or other geographic region and track which laborers come through in a given day, month, or year. And that might reveal to me the ways in which communities are centered and clustered and yet stratified, separated, and segmented, given that certain laborers do certain kinds of labor in a given location at different times of day, in differing levels of illumination, in differing conditions of ease. And these disparities aren't an accident to the system. They're very intentional. And so it conjures a question: how did this all become okay or necessary even? How did it become assumed fact that this organization of life is what makes the most sense, or is the best distribution of resources, or is the only option left? And so perhaps maybe like a brief little mindfulness meditation might get you and me closer to an answer. So you could close your eyes or not, but really just try to imagine what a much better life could look like. Maybe work only constitutes a couple hours a day, and it's all work that really matters, like dishwashing, garden tending, roof patching, plumbing fixing. But I know that there are certain structural daydreams that I would absolutely shy away from, that everyone alive could be well-fed always, or that everyone could see the doctor whenever they actually needed to. These sorts of daydreams, under capitalist logics, become impossible. But really dreaming and dreaming hard, these things very seriously could happen, and it would look radically different from the life that we're living now, or that I'm living now and have access to now. And it doesn't matter that it's improbable, especially not in this moment. What matters particularly to this moment in this room is that when I dare to imagine it, I tell myself that I can't or shouldn't bother. It matters that in this current life where I myself, have to get a job in like 2 weeks, or I'm not going to have a house or any food, and where murder happens both by police and non-uniformed white men, and where farmers across the world literally starve to death because they can't continue to afford Monsanto's seeds and fertilizers because global climate change has created perpetual droughts, and where the government still can't seem for some reason to stop drone strikes on children, and where the United Nations estimates of over 30 million humans enslaved in contemporary slave trades at any given moment. This is supposedly the best that can be done, and the best that I should dare dream of, that I'd be committing treason against my country if I did. I lie in wait for some revolutionary product or company to take the reins. I wait for the protests that will account for all of my political hang-ups. I wait in passivity, which means tacit, quiet, and unflinching acceptance. So given this predominant global organization of my day, structured around getting to and from work, around repairing my body so I might rest and return to work the next day, and constantly preparing my life and my nest so I might populate the earth with more good little workers, I consider what is actually left for me to make of my own life, given that I'm constantly at the whim of and raised seemingly totally swathed within these horrible, unethical relationships, even just between me and the commodities I produce. How can I look at you as a human? As cheekily romantic as it is, the question of finding love in the setting of these prevailing modes of relation is on my mind constantly. I mean, even at the beginning of this recitation, I pointed out I'm not really embodying the role of a human being, but the producer of a kind of knowledge. I'm appearing to solely play the part of a laborer. How could I be in love with anyone if we only ever saw each other as laborers? This is the social frame in which I attempt to find love. And it's generated as a result of the impulses and impositions of the capitalist form. I refer to this moment, and many others do, as like a moment of neoliberalism. This term intends to encapsulate that there's a new emphasis on the role of the individual as primary and singularly important. Each person is atomized and individuated and alone. This particular social configuration heightens the effects of what Marx calls alienation, which is truly like a perfect word to describe some sort of process or experience that fundamentally changes the laborer such that they are unable to see and unable to be seen as originating from this earth or from earthly human logics. This should be fundamental to the way I'm not only thinking of capitalist commodity production, but social relations themselves, all of which may or may not be already subsumed by the capitalist production anyways. But Marx is invoking this notion that something might not be of this earth, that it could be alien, to illuminate the distance as conjured by our conditions of living and laboring. And he surmises this pretty well in A Strange Labor, or a section called A Strange Labor in the Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts of 1844, but we're already sort of running out of time a little bit. The first paragraph that I attempt to quote relates the economic equations of labor markets, that humans are cheaper to hire when they're productive, because being productive means producing more value in less time, that you're literally investing yourself into the object of your labor, which then makes that object harder to purchase when it comes around to commodity consumption side, that it takes up more of your paycheck, or that you're paid less after having produced more. There's also the role of the worker as commodity, that they're buying and selling their labor relative to the markets. The second paragraph tells of the worker's alienation, that laboring produces an object that is seen as a congealment or an agglomeration of time and energy that is separated from the worker. There's a viral or parasitic relationship, and the commodity is wrenched away from the worker and made to stand on its own, be its own object after being the site of the laborer's energy and life force. The worker recognizes the object but cannot claim it. To make use of labor is to produce the objects that will eventually stand apart from us and dominate us, becoming the objects of our desire and hope for a better life. At the same time as my alienation from the objects of my labor is taking place, the structure of my workplace forces me into a state of alienation from my coworkers. I can't connect with anyone because talking on company time is deemed unethical, maybe even a fireable offense, depending on the structure of the company. Neoliberalism is truly like trying to conjure the sense that I am alone and that I can't develop camaraderie or community identity. It's the practice of watching others suffer, and that being the last of it, being unable to make these logical conclusions. We could collectivize our labor and actually like institute change or contestation. We couldn't begin to sum up our power because we are too fractured and too alone. So being socialized through neoliberalism, I struggle to see these structures that I've been vaguely describing as holding everyone down. I simply see my suffering, the suffering of others, and I automatically go to blame it on the individual because individuals become the end-all be-all of my logics. Such logics end up missing these machines of systems and control, or systems of control and discipline that are somehow entirely unassuming in their prominence. I then am inclined to go after the boss in ad hominem arguments rather than tear down the structure in which their power is afforded to them. So when I suffer, I do so in part because of the assemblies that limit my ability to recognize the structural components that produce my suffering. Again, I'm unable to produce a vision of an ideologically distinct and better life. And that part of that assemblage is that of the spectacle, which is Guy Debord's sort of like brainchild. He wrote first The Society of the Spectacle in 1967, and then his comments on the Society of the Spectacle in 1988, after watching the failures of multiple revolutions and after witnessing the power of the spectacle to reconstitute itself with time-defying fervor, and also like the assassination of multiple of his like cohort. Debord is attempting to discuss the ways in which not just media, but celebrities and social interaction itself function to condition us with capitalist ideologies. So the spectacle is, in one instance, for example, the intimately combined processes of looking upon an image produced in the sphere of the professional photojournalist and seeing not just people gathering supplies to survive a horrific disaster, but in a process introduced to us by external conditioning, interpreting from that image racist, sexist, and classist and ahistorical significations of looting and destruction, almost as if the people trying to save their own lives caused the nearly unimaginable disaster themselves. And so again, I don't have time to read these two sections that I've tried to quote from Debord, but to pull out, to really decontextualize two quotes from these two sections, he writes that the spectacle, is the heart of the unrealism of the real society. In all its specific forms, as information or propaganda, as advertisement or direct entertainment consumption, the spectacle is the present model of socially dominant life. And he says later as well, the spectacle again, says nothing more than that which appears is good, that which is good appears. So Debord even goes further than this to generate economies of spectacles and three particular varieties therein, the concentrated, diffuse, and later the integrated forms that doesn't really matter. But the surface understanding still provides a method of moving forward. That from here, I can generate a distinction between the signs and symbols that trade in ideological dominance, which pertain to a commodified existence, which I could refer to as spectacular, and alternative signs, symbols, and other productions that are ideologized differently. I might recognize all of this as just purely revamping of Marxist thought by Debord, and thus look with a wary eye at how it maintains the logical pitfall pointed out by J.K. Gibson Graham. The seeming uniformity, singularity, and totality of the spectacle is actually veneer, is appearances, not to say smoke and mirrors necessarily, but perhaps a convincing mask. And so Debord's misanthropy in his revisited comments puts forward the notions that there is nothing left, that there is no future in which I can hope that the spectacle will be defeated, that things are so dire even, and I quote, "Conversation is almost dead, and soon so too will be many of those who knew how to speak." And in all honesty, I think it is worthwhile to entertain both Debord's voice and Gibson Graham's voices. Perhaps Debord is right that I will never escape the spectacle, but only so long as I never mobilize myself through education and communalization. I might resist the power of the spectacle, which would absolutely happen only through anti-capitalist practice. So out of Debord's work, I might learn a kind of pessimism that is sort of endemic to critical theory, since this sort of, we could call it like a postmodern turn, which is often passed off as a kind of irony. But irony leads to a listlessness, a non-productive claim that the world is over. But there is serious work that can be done. It is immediately possible to fight back. This recitation, should it still be a product of the prevailing modes, is based on an economy of attention. As the owner of something interesting, my lecture here has to continually gather your eyes in order to be considered something valuable. I must make it hard for you to want to leave the room to use the bathroom, which you absolutely can, or order food, which you absolutely should. Perhaps I've put together an instance of the spectacle complete with built-in interpassivity that's even evoking and satisfying your need to produce an anti-capitalist motion. It's potentially a spectacular recitation, which makes you stare, dumbfounded, unable to actually activate your agency despite it being with you very seriously. And I'm sure, were I in your place, that it would be very hard for me to recognize that I personally have done nothing to limit your potential actions here. But through social conditioning, you and I are still all caught up in the game of it. You know, the very idea of the game being its own unique notion arising out of capitalist conditioning. And perhaps a major reason why this room has it morphed into a giant pizza, Chinese food, and chicken wings party is because you and I are afraid of our own willingness to torture ourselves. A practice learned from watching the rest of the world ostensibly misbehave, which, you know, comes out through the militaristic endeavors of the U.S. trying to colonize and bring other countries up to speed through varieties of means, like all of the practices of neocolonialism, and there's like all these other aspects of like, we're not really helping bail out the rest of the world from the crisis of global climate change, which we've caused through this kind of like accursed share social maneuvering that capitalist conditioning also encourages. So because the prevailing mode of production and relation in the world is capitalist, I'm fearful that this recitation as a production is in and of itself also capitalist. And you know, I've spent hundreds of thousands of dollars and months at a time learning how to be conscientious of what perpetuates capitalist practice and what resists it. And so far this recitation really only reveals itself in slight ways, only in gestures that are small, reaching behind the curtain to reveal the figure, letting the convincing mask slide around on the skull, losing credibility. And in a sense, if I want to, resist capitalism, then I have to allow for transparency, which is a kind of loss of credibility. But transparency, as its own sort of, branching term, is often made as a request to corporations and governments. And as a global citizen, which is a privilege that, is generally reserved for the white American, I want to know what is truly occurring in the world. And yet I don't know that things are any clearer than they ever have been. As political crises around the world, of which the U.S. is certainly playing a key role, develop into an abominable mess, I really don't have any actual clue why, and don't see that it is impacting the economy in any way. It continues to develop, and corporations around the world continue miserably gathering money into their coffers. And inversely, when projects like WikiLeaks arise, seeking to, maybe enact kind of potentially perhaps a slightly more truthful transparency, however dubiously, they're still painted as undemocratic and dangerous. And yet, WikiLeaks is giving me exactly what I should be getting from my corporations and governments when I demand transparency. It seems that when I finally hear about all the torturing, monitoring, extorting, and corruption that I assume exists, I'm angry at some sort of messenger when I finally find out for sure. And that the thing that WikiLeaks, of course, fails to provide constantly is incendiary reaction on part of the public, but not solely is it WikiLeaks' fault, for corporations and governments are constantly producing the spin, providing analyses that continually resubstantiate and re-legitimate their own roles as integral players. They put out the spectacular news release, which makes it impossible to accept anything but business as usual. Capitalism's coercion is occurring through hiding the real conditions and the potential futures, couching them in distance and impossibility, along with heaping doses of implicit violent threats. And thus transparency becomes a great game, a bad case of the spins, and utter vertigo. So in the grand debate for the distant future, I think of love, of course, its temporality, and it's being fraught with ethical quandaries. And set within this catastrophic zone, this truly dystopic reality, love follows what is overwhelmingly performed. I see in the way that I've been conditioned to see. I see figments of my imagination. I see sculpted figures. I see the game that I presume I should play. And the way that I learn is through copying, being contaminated with the practices of others, everyone creating a trend towards some particular set of ways of being. If I am here to suppose that there is resistance available as an option, what are my practices, however insufficient? I recognize fully that the de facto social relations imposed by the prevailing capitalist norms labels me as a locus of power in this room. And I can keep referencing that this place is contestable. But at the same time, that doesn't actually produce anything necessarily. I've mentioned ordering food or using the bathroom as you wish, but there's the reality at hand of capitalist appearances of authority and the assumption that the only available option is to remain passively accepting of assigned and assumed roles limit what you and I will do together. I don't think that I've actually done enough. If I want transparency, that I feel I must explain the conditions of this recitation further and the mechanics that are at play. For example, do you remember the first words I said tonight? The first words of this recitation. It began with, "I welcome you," and trails on and on to here. Those opening words were definitely intentional. There's a revisionary intent with this recitation, not to revise the past, but to make clear that this recitation in space is procedural and relational multidimensionally. That is, as Faith Wilding relates to her online correspondent, Irina Aristarkova, in an online exhibition under the working title Freundschaft Liebe, which is friendship, love in German, Irigaray invites me to revitalize my language with a more relational framework so that I can force a kind of recognition of both my mutability and your humanity through personally declarative rather than universally imperative sentences. Wilding writes in the correspondence, "I welcome you," and "I thank you," rather than bluntly directive, "welcome," or "thanks." And so to disentangle a certain alienness from my speech, I'm working to hold myself accountable for both potentially reifying while problematizing the prevailing modes of relation, as well as attempting to inscribe new patterns, expectations, behaviors, etc., etc. So while I want my work to be understood and interpreted as legitimate, I must not feign hegemonic authority over the disciplines at hand here. And I encourage you to remember my conditions as you interpolate or categorize me. Though I could be read as a locus of power in this room, as the owner of a sort of attention-demanding commodity of a lecture or recitation, as a semio-capitalist even perhaps, I'm not even 22 years old. I could ride upon a lot of historical social power, but I hope that I've been making myself vulnerable, and I know that I will continue to do so as the recitation moves forward. Hello? Yes, in the West Lecture Hall. Oh, yes. Just one second. Do you mind going and grabbing?
Receiving the pizza?
Yeah, it's by the back door where they bring So wrapped within these considerations for the presentational mode of this recitation, I'm also attempting to utilize aesthetic models of presenting not only content, but the form through which the content is most accurately and precisely employed. Peter Dimmock, for example, writes in his novel, A Short Rhetoric for Leaving the Family, of practicing my speech for the pleasured air, so I might be well versed in a representational form such as rhetorically decisive speech, with the hopes of delivering my points not simply clearly, but efficaciously, so I might ascertain my listener's agreement. More precisely, in his own words, a practiced idea of the ordered act and what task is to be accomplished by persuasion. As I return to regularly This lecture seeks to both problematize the prevailing modes and relay subversive, hidden, or fugitive modes of relational interaction that can allow me intimacy within the current setting, perhaps through, beyond, or behind the form of the recitation that I even employ now. And so yet, constantly abutting and abridging your and my autonomy in this space looms the persistent question: is this recitation, and separately, am I, actively contesting the hegemony imposed by capitalist conditioning? I hope it's not disingenuous to claim benefit in separating myself from this recitation for the sake of recognizing the ways in which I would adjust to your needs. And I choose the subjunctive tense that I would do so to remark that this recitation is already constructed, and moments where I ask for your feedback have been prepared for, which is only, slightly different from how I normally behave, but I can expand upon that more clearly in a moment. The mechanics at play may forever hamstring my will to continue. It creates a dis-ease, an impossibility of moving the recitation forward. And yet, that very dread dispatches and reignites the very urgency that spurred me to initially call this recitation into being. The circularity of this discourse, of this production, is a procedure of reminding myself why I've embarked, which is potentially one roundabout way of arriving to a brief "I thank you," and I'm so glad that you've come along with me. So moving on a little bit forward, looking at cultural artifacts that solidify and make prominent the emotive states of the lives from which they arise. I can hear David Byrne shout about all the disasters that can happen when love comes to town. Jet pilots and ship captains crashing, stockbrokers losing it all. Did they call out of work, or were they simply distracted with the realization that love will always struggle to exist under capitalism? Or is this what happens when capitalism is actually resisted? When I finally give in to the impulses of being human. When I finally give in to the impulses of being human, eschewing the capitalist confines of behavior and dynamic action, does love manifest as crisis striking the capitalist form? So if I take Byrne at his word that I am to risk my life in my attempts at love, if the system is designed to keep me fragmented, alienated, isolated, and alone, then how do I find methods of managing? What sorts of holes do I poke through in my honest opinion, pretty flimsy logic of the capitalist frame? When my days are centered around getting to and from work the next day, how do I devote myself to practicing being intimate? And in this case, I want to open intimacy up to pretty much any kind of disalienating human experience or connection. And this is as good as as good a place as any to practice new intimacies. As Byrne might entreat you, jump back, sit back, get back, relax. It'll be okay to do so. The capacity of this recitational form is especially effective here by curating very particularly the moments of both trust and distrust for the emotional realm. I'm expected to continue through the logical developments, exposing you to the emotional realm and the sort of eerie academic realm where you can feel, get mired, or become entirely disillusioned with it as you please. But I will be expected and am prepared to continue through to the completion of the academically defined logical thought. I hope that on some level you can let go of some of the anxieties that you're riding around with. In some ways, it's possible that we might come to the conclusion that it's only through reworking the tools of alienation that we can lay claim to our own lives again. Attempting to enact any sort of immediate contestation of the present forms, and with the hope of enacting a kind of futurity, requires breaking the capitalist prioritization of time over space. And this, again, harkens back to Debord, but is present in most of Marxist lineages, that if production is the site of alienation, or a site of alienation, rather, and if production is not simply a time-focused process, but an acceleration-dependent process under capitalism, I can find resistance in making placemaking and space-making as processes over time, rather than setting time as the independent variable. This recitation has the capacity, if I can detach from the anxiety of time slipping away, to renegotiate the social and productive relationships between space and time. Although, of course, only in a relatively limited and small way. If I reorganize my energy, thank you. If I reorganize my energy around establishing this place and this space collectively, then you and I can perhaps enact a break in the capitalist logic. This recitation, seeking to be fluent in its own mechanics, establishes tensions between my own conditioning and the future I wish to be able to embody. It is procedural and relational multidimensionally, and in this regard, I will continue pressing against the appearances and veneers that enforce misrecognition of my current conditions. I have to remind myself to move beyond the logics of neoliberalism, which would critique a bad president or a bad capitalist, and move towards structurally damning analyses, which condemns the role of the capitalist and the role of the president as positions that seek to maintain hegemonic neocolonial practices and to extract the submission of laborers within a given region of sovereignty. For example, to paraphrase Fahd Ahmed's thoughts shared here at Hampshire College at the 20th Iqbal Ahmad lecture, no business owner pays their workers minimum wage or less than minimum wage because they're uninformed or unaware of the impacts that it will have. While there are particularly bad humans in these positions of power, any instance of these positions of power, for example, managers, directors, VPs, CEOs, trustees, cops, et cetera, these are positions of power over other people. Anytime someone is employed to direct the helm without direct culpability to the community or labor force they pretend to serve, they're playing their part in the systems of domination. And as I am dominated through exploitation, I'm forced to reckon with my own position in the system. I recognize that I am distant from all others and distant from myself, unable to find a space where I won't be prefigured by the objects surrounding me, and yet I have to recognize that I am privileged to be couched constantly in a relative ease. But do you see me for who I am? And I wonder, can we all start to see each other for our blood? Again, the spectacle starts to return and haunt the truth, generating the unreal real society. Hundreds of millions of dollars are spent to produce special television interviews with presidents and multimillionaire celebrities to somehow prove that they are in fact real people despite their positions of power over others. The very phrasing utilized illuminating so much of the truth. And on the occasions that those interviews are interrupted with breaking news on lives taken by mass shooting, I can hardly react in a way that seems genuine anymore. To speak about the conditions, to run through the logics of why these mass shootings keep occurring has become in and of itself rote and tiresome. Or to even point out that any of the consistently discussed talking points are becoming scenery in and of themselves has itself become performative. Playing the part of someone informed, of someone who cares with a critical mind. And even though I do care and I seriously do care, I'm just playing the role in the eyes of everyone else. I'm fulfilling an expectation of awareness of current events, and I'm being an opinionated and outspoken member of the community. And while these values are certainly important, they become a breaking point for further action. It becomes difficult to move beyond claiming these character traits toward actually getting my body into collective action. And so I'm stuck constantly in a stage of trying to prove that I have a brain and a voice. And I generally do that over digital platforms, and then I have the privilege to go to sleep. I'm not actually in action with others. I've never actually even been to a protest. And coming clean to you like this is perhaps itself fulfilling another set of character traits, the self-aware, white, middle-class, masculine, queer. That is, despite my sincere attempts to be a human with you, I'm still just checking boxes. And it quickly becomes entirely unclear if I have any actual control over it. But I have to trust myself that it begins with sincere emotion. And it begins on the basis of an occurrence, which I can attempt to unpack with a somatic framework. That the body isn't swathed within an event, or that maybe the body itself is an event, resulting in a series of irreparable changes. I think this is a pretty easy notion to follow, that upon interpreting an event, categorizing my emotions and my affects and experiences, there's irreparable change imposed. I'm never the same after any event. And so I'm especially altered after heartbreak, which happens to me, I think, just about all the time. I think a decent definition of heartbreak, though, is the loss of something that I've come to understand as part of my normal. The loss of something previously utterly reliable, which may even be the loss of the trust or belief or hope or whatever you want to call it that something won't happen. Heartbreak at being broken up with, heartbreak at the start of a new war. So every time this happens, the first thing I want to do is reach out to as many people as possible, begin to take stock of what is still reliable, which is a pretty natural response. To go through that check-in, I used to rely on a whole host of social media platforms to get the word out about my affectual and emotional states. To call out to my communities, please, everyone, say I love you. And in many ways, it was a communal process, as me and my friends were always screaming to each other through the Facebook void. And while I did usually find methods of supporting and getting support through the digital, I was still a subject of the social media apparatuses, which were always prepared for my fears, anxieties, and outrages. That preparation, of course, manifested in two parts. The first being that the machines distended my emotive outpourings and placed them into realms where in all reality, all that I wrote incited nothing, deconstructed nothing, only ever perpetuating the same issues and leading me to the same results. And second, I didn't notice for a long time, but content started to be carefully curated to reflect what I was concerned with, finding ways of keeping my eyes peeled to the screen for longer. In this practice of emotional support, the process was always truncating growth to halfway points, allowing, as I said, the same mistakes to be made. Looking backward, it becomes clear that all those forms of attempting to express myself became part of the alienated system, which is borrowing a little bit from Slavoj Žižek, who's quoted in Black Transparency, The Right to Know in the Age of Mass Surveillance, as saying, there are two telltale words here, abstraction and control. In order to manage a cloud, there needs to be a monitoring system that controls its functioning, a system that is by definition hidden from the end user. The paradox is thus that as the new gadget, smartphone or tiny portable, I hold in my hand becomes increasingly personalized, easy to use, transparent in its functioning, the more the entire setup has to rely on the work being done elsewhere, on the vast circuit of machines which coordinate the user's experience. In other words, for the user experience to become more personalized or non-alienated, it has to be regulated and controlled by an alienated network. So Zizek is claiming that the alienated nature of the networks that make my tiny portables work still offers a non-alienated experience. Excuse me. And on some level, I do agree with that, but there's still a lot of limits to that, and I want to sort of complicate that further and offer that to varying extents, all data transferred along these hidden networks are alienated from their true sources, and that truly any generation of a sense of disalienation is likely conjured by the user interface of the platform that you're attempting to utilize. So I might think, for example, of the difference between 10 cartons of milk in actuality and the pure theoretical number 10 appearing next to the words cartons of milk in a digital text. And these things are, of course, really fucking different. I can drink physical milk. I can, experience that, but I can only pass the data of 10 cartons of milk back and forth. And sure, of course, with Postmates and all other sorts of things, you can now eventually conjure 10 cartons of milk to your doorstep, but it's still going through this process of gesturing, poor translations, even though it comes from sincere somatic events. So the fundamental difference holds true also for emotions. The actuality of a hug from someone who loves me is a physical dimensional experience. While reading the digital text hugs from someone who loves me is just data referencing an attention one would have if they were here, and that starts to enter this double subjunctive tense, which is really interesting. Brian Masumi has some writing on that. But at the same time, all this data is also subject to slippage, to being warped into advertisements for who knows what. Of course, in the recognizable jargon, those who also needed hugs ended up purchasing these commodities too. In this capacity, when I think I'm generating outcry at unimaginable horrors and terrorism, or generating meaningful expressions of love toward my loved ones, my voice becomes co-opted by the networks and by these machines. To communicate, I'm reliant on these systems of levers and pulleys that are so complex and bridge such large distances that I'm actually, in fact, not in touch with anyone else, but in touch with the machine. And of course, Karl Marx has some pretty choice words for those who work with machines, saying, and I quote, feeders, or that he calls them feeders, who supply the machines with the materials to be worked. So while tools are manipulated by the laborer, machines are seemingly autonomous, simply requiring servants who will feed the raw materials into the machines and subsequently take the finished product. And so whereas machines revolutionizing labor in non-digital industries cause massive displacements of laborers across the world, digital industrial machines now revolutionizing the world are largely social machines. I am a feeder of the objects that mediate my social relations. I'm perpetuating, substantiating the spectacle by laboring constantly to give the machines the necessary content to produce it. In the context of emotional labor, these machines presume to offer a displacement of physicalized care labor, potentially transforming the practices and methods of care into digital global networks. My argument is that digital care is still fundamentally alienating, or put another way, is never going to fully disalienate. And not like any experience actually could fully disalienate anyone, but, So I consider the significance of allowing, for example, my phone as a particular instance of the digital apparatus to take on this sort of role. As Hartle and Gandesha recently defined the notion of the microspectacle as the ever-shrinking and portable digital technology, the computers, iPads, iPhones, iWatches, wearable technologies, and the universally accessible social media, such as Facebook, Twitter, RenRen, Weibo, and a whole host of hookup sites that they make immediately available and present, whose varied and precise algorithms reflect back to us our own desires, what we always were, knew, and did all along. And so I want to wedge back into this moment the words of Sarah Ahmed, whom I earlier paraphrased. And her words now are, to me, become especially interesting now that they're intersecting Zizek and Hartle and Gandesha's thoughts. She writes, "Objects that give us pleasure take up residence within our bodily horizon. We come to have our likes, which might even establish what we are like. The bodily horizon could be redescribed as a horizon of likes. To have our likes means certain things are gathered around us." And she even goes further to comment that the things that we don't like find distance from us, or we work to distance ourselves from the things that we don't like. So these intersecting logics point me towards a pretty uncomfortable conclusion. That is, I think I've made it decently clear in this recitation that capitalism is not incidentally insidious, that it purposefully eviscerates ecological life. And yet, of course, it does not do so, singularly, totally, or uniformly. Nevertheless, one of the primary somatic results that I'm interested in is the resulting fundamental alienation that eviscerates communities and individuals. I've mentioned some of the primary mechanisms in which alienation occurs on a social level and the preponderance of these alienating outlets. And of course, in this regard, the phone, the computer, generally the digital apparatus, all function as the primary propagators of the spectacle on the interpersonal level. Despite attempts to use these apparatuses to connect through to others, I'm still left alienated by using them at all. And yet, given Sarah Ahmed's point, what does it mean that my phone is closer to me always than other humans? I make a point to never leave my house without the universally required tokens of functional participation in the world. And this largely is like, my wallet, my phone, my keys, my watch. All these things are fundamentally alienating. My wallet and my phone are, a big too, and I've been raving about the general digital apparatus, but the wallet is its own unique historical vessel, symbolic of the highly technologically advanced algorithms that now run my financial complexes. So does it not speak volumes that these two objects, barely separated from my skin by threads, I'm again talking about phone and wallet, spend more time held incredibly close to my body, barely separated from my skin by threads, than any human? According to the orders of my bodily horizon, no matter how close next to me you might come, the true way to be as close to me as physically possible is to enter my horizon by a text or by a debt. I really love that, so I'm going to read it again. According to the orders of my bodily horizon, no matter how close next to me you might come, the true way to be as close to me as physically possible is to enter my horizon by a text or by a debt. Near the opening of this recitation, I made clear I'm relying on J.K. Gibson Graham's point that the patterns of Marxist theory, or that most patterns of Marxist theory, reify capitalism into something that is utterly hegemonic. Gibson Graham identified singularity, totality, and uniformity as the rhetoric that maintains capitalism's invincibility. But what makes Gibson Graham so sure that most lineages of Marxist theory are wrong to do so? To be clear, I don't always believe Gibson Graham's claim either. Because given all the points of domination, beginning with conditioning that started early on in my childhood, what could possibly be done by me with my current resources to significantly change anything? But the point, I think, is that if I think small enough, a moment of contestation could exist anywhere. And maybe to actively resist means to engage new relational modes. And relations, dependent on representation, are fundamentally aesthetic. However, I do need to note that supposed aesthetic interventions are not inherently subversions or contestations, and it's also important to note that subversion is not in and of itself an ends, but a means toward producing a more confrontational and oppositional means, which is to say, imagining the utopic future is not imagining a subversion of or from the current moment. It's imagining a break from or a full contestation of the current moment. How can I arrive there? How do I know that I'm breaking away and creating a different relational field of possibility for life and being? In the grandiose sense, an angle of approach for imagining potential futures is located around renovation, the etymological root of which starts with the roughly 1400s term renovation, which intones not only rebuilding and reconstruction, but also spiritual rebirth. So if I am to dream of the utopic future, I must allow myself to start from a place of spiritual rebirth and renewal. If my visions for the future are dependent on or following out of the contemporary logics at hand, I have no doubt in my mind that I will only reproduce the current moment with all its dangers and forms of violence. Maybe I am desperately hopeful, but I believe that there are deep changes afoot. Regrettably, I cannot pretend that I don't stand in the way of renovation, and I return to Diane de Prima often to remind myself and to limit how far ahead of myself I might get. She writes for me in Revolutionary Letter number 12, "The vortex of creation is a vortex of destruction. The vortex of artistic creation is the vortex of self-destruction. The vortex of political creation is a vortex of flesh destruction. Flesh is in the fire, it curls and terribly warps. Fat is in the fire, it drips and sizzling sings. Bones are in the fire, they crack tellingly in subtle hieroglyphs of oracle. Charcoal singed, the smell of your burning hair. For every revolutionary must at last will his own destruction, rooted as he is in the past he sets out to destroy." I know that I personally have been submerged in the projects of capital accumulation for too long. I know that some of my fantastical reveries of what my life might look like are arising from what Vijay Prasad has called the grammar of the past. I want to note that I also intentionally did not change the pronouns in the last couple of de Prima's poem. I left he and his, because I believe that de Prima recognized the especially violent kind of conditioning that most men receive, and realized the way that men behave will always be some form of antiquated social relations. It has taken hundreds of years in this locale for men to start to be held accountable for their actions, which is unfortunately understandable given all the histories and methods of violence that surged this world. So despite whatever renovations I've attempted to undergo myself, I am still a product of old ways of being, particularly my old ways of being. Already, this whole production has taken a lot longer than I'm comfortable with. But I wanted you to agree with me. I wanted to believe that given, a practiced idea of the ordered act and what task is to be accomplished by persuasion, I could efficaciously utilize the mode of recitation to secure your agreement, make it clear that the current moment is urgently awaiting both of us, you and myself, to awaken from a somnolent state, to become aware, to arise out of passivity towards resistance. I hope to arise by letting out everything that feels vital, allowing all of my unreasonable demands to be made in full, unmitigated honesty. I have, up to now, really only attempted this, but this I can demonstrate to you by making visible my archive, extracting the contents, and given the formulated frameworks previously discussed, unpacking the significance of the archived materials. But given all this, to make sense of my archive as it stands, I might need to first better understand it in its undifferentiated ubiquity. That is to say, removing specificity from the archive for a moment, it begins to reflect all that I might expect from any personal archive from a person growing up in the early 21st century. I might begin to recognize, of course, an economy of nostalgia and memory. Given that my attention is persistently stretched to its very limit through the technological advancement of society, and rather than simply let me sit and fret about my memory dissipating, the language of technology literally integrated into the very concept of memory. Long-term stable storage is now cheaply expansive beyond what was previously thought possible, and it becomes the receptacle into which I pour myself into flash and cloud storage form, slipping the archive from a historically material and physical state into the malleable, ubiquitous, and shiny digital form. I am, as de Boer describes in Comments on the Society of the Spectacle, subject to a technological world designed and chosen by someone else. And I see this in the ways my data is formatted to particular formulations, timestamps, geolocations, methodologies of interaction. My emotional outpouring into the digital realm is forced to adhere to what these platforms deign to facilitate. And they're subject to the profit motive. They're never altruistic. And so data analytics in and of itself is, as a process in the realm of digital social interaction, becomes a vital method of understanding how to keep the spectacle relevant and valuable to the spectator. Through these analytic methods, I'm considered known and glommed within larger patterns and trends. Others who, like you too, also like Sting, the police, Christianity, centrist political views, et cetera, for example. Facebook's ability to inconspicuously house a comprehensive database of likes, friends, syntax, and other aspects of our identities is spun as miraculous, but truly is only generating a tighter web of control. Further, the codes that allow for such ubiquitous tracking are not limited to Facebook domains. As Barcelona-based artist and researcher Joanna Mall exhibited in her web project Algorithms Allowed, even websites based in countries the US maintains embargoes against, the whole list comprising of Cuba, Iran, North Korea, Sudan, Syria, and the Ukrainian region of Crimea, utilize proprietary trackers and codes from US companies. She writes in the artist statement, and I'm quoting just a section here, "Nevertheless, Google trackers and other online services such as Google Fonts and so on, owned by the American IT giant, have been found within several websites owned by countries under US embargo. It's important to remember that these websites are stored inside hard disks placed in physical territories. Moreover, I recently found Google trackers within the official web page of North Korea and tried to sell them on eBay as a .txt file. Even though the item was just an intangible piece of data, property of a US company, it was banned immediately by a bot, another piece of code in charge of enforcing US policy. At this point, the usually unacknowledged agency of code is undeniable." Excuse me. Mall is pointing to the extra-legal nature of capital in a way that shocks me into awareness. If one were to visit one of the 28 sites of North Korea, one would be tracked by the same company that gives me Google Search, Google Maps, Google Translate, Chrome, YouTube, Google Play Music and Movies and TV, Chromecast, the Pixel phones, the Google Home, Daydream View virtual reality infrastructure, Google Wi-Fi, the official Android distributions, various Android wearable accessories, Chromebooks, Gmail, Google Allo and Google Duo, Google Plus, Google Photos and Picasa, Google Contacts and Calendar and Keep, and in addition to Google Docs, Sheets, Slides, and Drive, and lastly that I'll mention, Google AdWords, AdSense, Analytics, and Google My Business. But there are more. There are dozens more. And it becomes immediately clear why Google changed its parental holding company to Alphabet. They're working to literally take control of our language on every level, beyond their mobile phone keyboard application Gboard. For years, they've even attempted to make their claim on the literal earth by branding it with a big multicolored Google logo. Meanwhile, the political realm is, of course, its own perpetual hotbed of activity. In the same way I shouldn't have been surprised that the NSA was harvesting more data than could be managed by a government agency, I also shouldn't have been shocked by the amateurish behavior that marked a seemingly unnoticed moment of the summer of 2017. When it came out that a data analytics company contracted with the Republican National Convention accidentally left openly available on a cloud server, and I quote, accessible by anyone who found the URL, according to the Gizmodo article, a comprehensive database of, and I quote, roughly 61% of the US population, end quote, which included not only, and I quote, home addresses, birth dates, and phone numbers, end quote, but also, and I quote again, lastly, advanced sentiment analyses used by political groups to predict where individual voters fall on hot-button issues such as gun ownership, stem cell research, and the right to abortion, as well as suspected religious affiliation and ethnicity, end quote. This cache of profiles and documentation on various kinds of analytics was patchworked together utilizing data harvested by a variety of companies and organizations, including the Koch brothers Political Action Committee, Americans for Prosperity, among others. What these instances signify is that I'm being anticipated. No action is unprecedented. All of my behaviors are easily manageable, metricized, and accounted for, tallied up. And I'm one in just 325 million people in America and 1 in 7.6 billion people in the world. Forget the actual intentional input of posts and texts that I send that get scooped up into the economic production of Facebook and Google. Simply allowing machines to run near me allows for passive production. My computer or my phone falsely appearing idle on my desk and nightstand while they contribute data to the digital global economy. This goes beyond the binary notion of the working day, toward the sublimation of the working day into every aspect of every minute. From the sound of my dreaming murmurs to my private conversations, from my movements across town to my regular sleep cycles in bed. And this is, of course, constantly expanding and accelerating to the point that, smartwatches can now start to predict when you're going to take your next drag of a cigarette, all sorts of things like that. All this data becomes part of some archive of, the big other, our big brother, which is odd to think about. The sounds of me sleeping can only be made useful in the context of an unimaginably large data set. It takes analysis of thousands of individuals' data in order to discern the patterns and create a predictive model. And this is why I spent so long not caring about Facebook. My archive and its utter specificity is truly its own form of useless, just like the sounds I make while I sleep. I wouldn't be able to produce anything out of that data without placing it next to thousands of others. Unless I set algorithms upon the accrued detritus, the contents of my archive are incredibly hard to track and incredibly difficult to make valuable. Despite copious amounts of labor on all sides of the given and received artifacts in the archive, these items cannot be traded until they are worked upon further. No one would ever buy the pin to Mass Mocha that I've saved, or the brochures to the Brooklyn Botanical Garden, or the poster to the Horse Lord show in the Hampshire Dining Commons from 2016. If I printed everything out, created a beautiful display of the works, products, artifacts, detritus, posters, cards, recordings, images, etc., 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 what would anyone be able to glean? There would be a perpetual lacking of value from the external viewer's point of view. These objects are impenetrable, impossible to unpack to anyone outside the exchange. And in a rough comparison, when I'm given the digital object, it's a falsely simple to confront the translatability of the objects, the ubiquity of its presence, the ways in which I can be followed by it through cookies that monitor web page activity and even pick up on data on which sites I've visited prior and subsequently. It's the translatability of the digital artifact from one platform to the next that leads to reason nothing in the digital realm is a unique experience. If I'm invited to an event on Facebook, it doesn't matter if there are 50 or 10,000 other people invited, I get the same notification. And it sounds eerily similar to when someone direct messages me on Twitter or Instagram. Further, these streams are crossing previously insurmountable divides, informing advertising schemes, policing tactics, drone policies, and obviously manipulation of government elections. Meanwhile, data centers are becoming ecological black holes, increasing energy and water demands. But again, what is presented to me as end user are these simple outputs which pose as helpful reminders, suggestions, and ideas. But they are so reductively innocent that they diminish the true threat of things like algorithm-based predictive policing, for example. It's important to recognize that these data streams are subject to all our irrationalities and irreconcilable differences. Data has the same potential to be as racist as any book, TV show, or other cultural production, not to mention sexist, classist, or ableist. The platforms I rely upon have been sculpted by the likes of James Damore, the software engineer ousted from Google after posting a deeply sexist rant on the internal Google message board, and Peter Thiel, founder of PayPal and big-time investor in technologies of infinite longevity and parabiology, which is like the use of other people's organs for your own sustenance. But so these people are intentionally pushing capitalism towards its most efficient and violent capacities. Capital initially arose out of the labor of the worker, but it's now arising even further from the thoughts and affects of the laborer and subsists now on the laborer's blood. Their philosophies, often arising out of the cultish cybernetics and culture research unit that spawned the Dark Enlightenment by incident, perpetuate violent ideologies and create quietly churning algorithms and cryptocurrency schemes to finance their addled demonological dreams. So these inscriptions upon the platform machines revamp the ability to take from me and make me work over the course of every hour of every day. This difficult-to-notice change is what inspired Laurel Patak to revamp wages against housework into wages for Facebook, which, of course, has its conceptual merits to remind me that pouring myself into Facebook is truly actually a lugubrious endeavor. It is a form of wealth production for the likes of the shareholders. But manifestos don't stop the flows at hand here. Regardless of the contents of my multimodal archive of digital, physical, emotional, and intellectual detritus, each artifact is always under threat of slippage out into a new sphere of production. Maybe next I'll be part of a data set that will predict when I'll buy myself, Sibby's pizza out of depression based on the syntax of my texts and my location data indicating how long I've stayed in bed. And whoever does come up with that algorithm is going to make a lot of money. Yet, I still maintain my devotion to whatever practices of communication actually work. I still hold on to notes, onto screenshots of whatever comes across my screen, and perhaps even more tellingly, I make duplicate and triplicate copies of my stored media. These practices imply that there are still small gains to be made, a pattern of perhaps resistance to the forces of alienation that are so controlling. I work to find some manner of renegotiating my relations to what is around me, so I'm not prefigured by the commodities or forces that dominate and alienate me. In all honesty, I don't know if any of this is making any sense. I've written this and rewritten this in the months prior to reciting it to you. Normally, when I converse with my interlocutors and correspondents, I don't have so much material prepared. I prefer the spontaneous, unplanned, and almost incidental explorations into the conceptual. This recitation, perhaps because, like writing poetry, it has been written alone, lacks your voice, and is flat, and is utterly unsatisfying to me as a place to rest. What I'm more interested in so many words, is what it feels like to be in a room with other people again, to gather a space, to feel social again. I run into the same predicament with my emails, that I'm writing them alone, each paragraph feeling empty, waiting for the social nature of the response. But hearing back from my correspondent is what is constituting the joy of the exchange. It's only as a thread or a collection that the emails begin to make a wild departure from what is expected. According to a web page from a 2002 class project at the Computer Science Department of the University of Maryland, electronically sent messages have existed since the first decades of the 1900s. However, what they identify as the more contemporary recognizable email format that I've come to know and love is that emails are more readily available, interoperable between systems, available worldwide, inexpensive, much better known, generally comply with standards, much easier to use, and lastly, fashionable. This notion of emails being fashionable definitely dates the class project, perhaps speaking to the zeitgeist of 2002, where Nora Ephron's 1998 romantic dramedy, You've Got Mail, starring Tom Hanks, had only been released 4 years prior, and Sharon Maguire's Bridget Jones's Diary, which also featured email, apparently came out in 2001. Perhaps email really did have its own fashionable zeitgeist, but now, as I've gleaned from mainstream narratives about the stress and strain of email, it's seemingly only used by professionals or con artists, and is filled with a series of formalities that wards off many from utilizing email for social communiques. And I generally thought so too. It was only upon receiving a very particular email on Monday, November 21st, 2016 at 7:23 p.m., which I honestly could recite to you by memory now, did I realize that email could be my needed poetic intervention in a field where the tools of predominantly available communication were utterly lacking. I had really confronted the limitations of the predominant modes of communication. Purely in terms of user interface, most other mediums are utterly insufficient. Chatting and texting are generally innocent enough, but in reality, they're incredibly difficult to use. They force eclipse speech, they constantly truncate thought. I'm always persistently hamstrung by the potential of overwhelming the entire screen with one message, upon which all other text is cleared. A bleak wall of black text on gray background is directed at my interlocutor. And receiving that message is upsetting and nerve-wracking. What the hell is all this? I even ask myself sometimes, even about my own messages. The visual structure, the constant interruptions, the utterly inept search engines that make these visual and operational limitations of texting and chatting impossible to use for satisfying social communication. In a similar vein, the often romanticized medium of the phone call is, as many of my friends agree, a kind of difficult and anxiety-producing experience, largely, I think, due to the lack of social signals. I'm stranded in my own realm, and this voice is coming through to me from God knows where. And I'm sure almost everyone here has heard someone flush the toilet while on the phone. It's incredibly weird. And speaking of the toilet, please do feel free to use the toilet. And video chatting is not an improvement on this form in my experience, as my own presentation supersedes the importance of whatever else may be on the screen. I have to manage my image, my angles, my lighting, my affectations, and somehow at the same time still stay present in and attentive to the conversation. I've become a devotee of the email form because it eschews many of the communicative impediments of those other forms. Emails are instantaneous digital letters, even improving upon the historical limitations of the letter, the most prominent being that each correspondent holds on to a copy of everything. Historically, with each letter sent, I would lose 1/2 of the production, but the email form maintains all communication as mutual property, available at any time with a properly comprehensive search engine provided by the email service. But this is a historical advancement in email technology, as we can note from personal archives, such as the email correspondence between Kathy Acker and Mackenzie Wark from 1995, where it's pretty clear that at a time, emails were fluid, flighty, and unstable, that they could be lost in a permanent way. Fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on how I feel about it, I'm living in a technological prime of email production, always synchronized through network-intensive cloud protocols. And further, it's way less of a faux pas to send copious amounts of text at once due to the user interface, which allows for serious extended exposition. But of course, try sending multiple emails at once. It's incredibly embarrassing still. I don't know why. Like I forgot the attachment. Here it is. That's awful. But my endearment to the email form might come across as hypocritical, as I've spent so much time criticizing the digital apparatus. It would, in one formulation, be logical that my harsh critiques of the technologies arising out of capitalism would lead me to be a proponent of smashing phones and cameras and establishing coordinated attacks on the physical data centers that keep track of my debts. And while I am a proponent of the Jubilee of debt or the right to insolvency, as Franco Berardi discussed in The Uprising on Poetry and Finance, I can't ignore my reality. If the current moment is a moment of temporal inflation, as I discussed at the start of this recitation, which results in selling myself for longer in order to buy back the more valuable moments that I lose, then leisure or social spaces are in their own right undergoing their own form of hyperinflation, where the costs and impediments to entry and access become insurmountable given my own resources. The result is that I'm not only denied fulfilling social relations within my workplace, I'm further denied access to the needed time, energy, and money to access public social space. So how could I smash my phone if it is the only place that I am getting access to even slightly fulfilling social interactions? These digital platforms never shut off. They don't get shut down, which is to say, I truncated the actual series of events that occur when I use these digital apparatuses. I've said again and again that I'm isolated when I use these machines, and along the way, as my thoughts are channeled between input and output, there's all this scraping and analysis that occurs that contributes to a world of surveillance of different kinds. But I left out some kind of explanation of what it means to read, which in the email context means reading the reply, which I always hope at least means that I've been read, and thus have somehow inspired or catalyzed what has been sent to me. But in truth, as much as I may love to write and read the words of my own thoughts, which I usually don't, the whole process leads up to having a new series of thoughts to dance and to weave new connections and interrogations with. That's why I send out all these missives to my friends. That's why this works. The real truth is that the beauty of written language has never been about my own thoughts being written down. It's the dual magic of knowing my words conjured a reply, and the words returning with some kind of deep love into my inbox, coming as close to landing in my palms as I can manage, the closest I can get to your hand linked with mine. So it's an unfortunate truth for someone who's taken 6 college-level poetry workshops, but no words I've ever written have stayed meaningful or fresh. Yet the words that are intentionally and decidedly sent to me from my correspondence are bursting, full, and packed. But perhaps it's due to the resonance of the internet. So much data, so many voices, so many opinions, so many people who already look like me, who already write exactly like me, all of us packed and repacked into tidy data sets. Sure, it would be easy to lose sight of what all this is for, looking only on one side of the digital apparatus. I might become disillusioned with the overwhelming vastness of the internet, but emails arrive every so often. And when they do, my day stops. The capitalist production of time stops, and I hear the words of the people I love speak to me. It changed my world in some capacity to receive an email in which my correspondent wrote, "I think about sitting next to you and talking to you as much as I think about making you come or your hips against mine." I keep that email and the whole series of threads in my inbox as a reminder that I can be the subject of someone else's statement, which, as Andrew Goffey in Software Studies, a Lexicon signifies, or he writes in Software Studies, the Lexicon, this signifies something big. He writes that for Foucault, the statement is not analytically reducible to the syntactic or semantic features of a language. It refers instead to its historical existence and the way that this historical existence accomplishes particular actions. So in this case, if I am the subject of a sentence, I'm exceeding the role of syntactical subject of another's sentences. I'm moving beyond, this locked-in, lingual function that I'm living into a moment and becoming an action for someone else. I'm reminded of my duty to connect to others and to live radically with similar rage and intent that strikes through the calls made in Diane de Prima's revolutionary letters. It emerges as a vital practice to interrogate each moment. Is the light spilling from my computer to be used as a flashlight, searching for the words from those I love for answers to my questions? Or is it a spotlight meant to illuminate a spectacle that makes me unable to see, unable to be bewildered by the non-digital world around me? What makes emails so precious in these various capacities is that they even overcome the binaries that I've set out here. And there is deep reward in constructing my own understandings of the digital mess of the world, because it is futile, it lacks direction, it appears to be utterly meaningless. It is procedural and relational multidimensionally. It's a space where I can reimagine love. Through the hard work in constructing a social environment one-on-one with my correspondents, I've been able to access generative social codes of respect, discourse, and exploration. The emails have been a first and perhaps ultimate iteration of this work. They are my most precious possessions, my best poems. In fact, in response to a correspondent who asked me why I never sent them any of my poems, I wrote in an email dated Saturday, August 12th, 2017, 6:51 p.m., "Have you not thought our emails as poetry? I'm sending you my material constantly." My correspondent's response, which came to me under the subject line, "which is a building," said, "Our emails are poetry. A mutual friend said as much when I showed her an email I sent you. It feels easy and less painful than trying to write, which is remarkable, to find a way to circumvent my anxiety about writing and actually write." And like I said, it's always been about the words, the love that comes into my inbox, to my palms. These things, emails or notes or letters from the angels in my life, though they're not perfect, fit for the moment. While any time I spend using my computer or my phone are cheap imitations of what I really need, I can make the imitations rich and palpable. And I'm fortunate to not be alone in utilizing email for intimate purposes, that my use of email is not without some minor precedents beside the fictive realities of popular dramedies You've Got Mail and Bridget Jones's Diary. For example, the executor of avant-garde heavyweight Kathy Acker's literary estate published her 1995 email correspondence with media theorist Mackenzie Wark under the title, "I'm Very Into You" in 2015. It has been remarked upon as an exciting foray into the surely impending new form of love letter, the epistolary, and has been valued for its simultaneous, engaging, and utterly inaccessible archiving of academic, cultural, social, and queer intimacy and connection. But truly, no words I've ever written have stayed fresh and meaningful. In the end, nothing I have to say matters that much to me. But is being close to someone a radical disturbance of capitalism? It certainly does change something. It reignites a textual self-expression that is constantly denied to me by user interfaces. But what does it mean to fully explain oneself under capitalism? To explore patience, attention, and devotion? Does it bring me any closer to exiting the interiority of the capitalist realm? How is a recitation such as this one just a first step, maybe in a cycle, maybe of emails? If you're mad, confused, excited, or lonely, drop me a line at jhsalzberg@outlook.com or say I love you separated by underscores at outlook.com. Maybe we can consider this the start of the first email in our mutually owned archive. Because, to write email is procedural and relational multidimensionally. It requires knowing the order and what is to be accomplished by vulnerable communication. I eagerly await your response, but I'm going to sign off for now. Good night. I love you. 8-ball, corner pocket, Josh. Thank you all so much for coming. This was huge, utterly unexpected. No pizza left, that's great.
I think I'm a janitor.
Oh, we're all the janitors here.
Josh.
Yeah, I'm good. Well, I hope everyone has a great night. Thank you all so much. I'll be around for a couple moments, but there's no formal Q&A or anything. Thank you all.